of the society. And with this, I'd like to introduce our first keynote speaker, MAJID EZZATI. MAJID is a professor of global environmental health at Imperial College in London, and he's director of the Wellcome Trust Imperial Center for Global Health Research and director of the WHO Collaboration Center on Non-Communicable Disease Surveillance and Epidemiology. MAJID, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rika, for the introduction, and thanks especially to all the organizers for inviting me. It actually makes me feel good as a non-epidemiologist to be invited to talk at epidemiology conferences, and it allows me to actually have a job in the epidemiology department. So thank you for letting me have my job. When the idea of this talk came up, I remember that in 2007, when ISEE was in Mexico City, I had given a talk about cities. So I figured, okay, 12 years later, I should be able to say something new, and the field hopefully has moved forward enough to be able to. I am glad that I'll be able to do that, but I think there is still a number of challenges. So I'll talk about cities as what I call unequal opportunities for health, and the deputy mayor just about gave away all of my talk by the things that he mentioned, both as opportunities and on the sort of, I think if I'm quoting you right, no one left behind. So the equity aspect of it. And I hope to actually end by just some directions which we may want to collectively think about as we move forward with our empirical research. Cities are where we live. They are in a place like Netherlands, but they're also globally. On the graph on the left-hand side, you can see the distribution of the population of the world between rural areas, which is in green, and urban areas of different sizes, which is in all of the other colors. So we live in a world that the rural population is no longer increasing. And in many cities, actually, as we can see on the right-hand side, certainly in Europe, but elsewhere in the world is actually declining. So this is an urban planet, and cities are where we should be thinking about systematically as we think about the health of our people. And cities are opportunities for health. So this paper actually is from the 1970s. And really around 1950, so the post-war era was when health scientists broadly started to think about the fact that more and more people are moving to cities. In the 1950s, the UN actually commissioned a report led by Nathan Kafetz, the prominent demographer of the time, to think about people's health as they move to cities. And this paper started to look at the evidence. And it went through the data, and actually it shows that there were data even in the 1970s from places like Peru or Iraq and many places in the Americas and in Europe, that fundamentally they argued that nutrition is better in cities, and that's one of the reasons that people move to cities. So cities exist because people actually feel that they are better off living in cities than in rural areas. And the quote that I have highlighted there, so that's about America, and it argues that to the best that the evidence could show them, rural malnutrition, even in the 1970s, in America existed. It was getting worse. It wasn't geographically concentrated in one part of the country, and it wasn't a particular ethnic group. So cities were opportunities, and that's why people moved there. 2007, when I gave my talk in Mexico City, was significant because 2008 was the year that actually the world was officially 50% urban, according to the UN. So in that year, there were two really interesting papers published entirely independently. One was by Chris Dye from WHO in Science magazine. And Chris actually looked at the evidence on health, in this case, urban and child mortality, and to the best that it existed across low and middle income countries. And he actually found that, in general, child mortality was lower in cities. And interestingly, it was also lower for the poor. So the left-hand side shows urban compared to rural, and if a point is above the 45-degree line, it's better in cities, and most of them are. And on the right-hand side, it's comparing the poor to the non-poor. And on the vertical axis, it's cities. So if a point is above the x-axis, it means that the urban rich are doing better. And on the horizontal line, it's the rural areas. And if a point is on the right-hand side of the y-axis, it means that the rural, that there is actually an advantage to cities among the poor. And most of the points are to the right-hand side. So the urban poor, so people always say that, no, the cities are better, but not for the poor. And actually the urban poor were doing better than the rural poor. So cities are good no matter whether you're rich or poor, at least from the perspective of infant and child mortality. The second paper, which was by Dave Leon, actually took a historical look and argued that, to the best that we have evidence from Europe and America, since the middle of 19th century, since really modern sanitation came, there has always been an urban health advantage. And then started to look forward. And I actually, again, have highlighted a quote that David argues that actually it's unlike social scientists, unlike economists and historians, that public health generally has a negative view of cities. And he argued that the empirical evidence goes against this. Both papers raised the question of how is it for non-communicable diseases? The evidence was actually more sparse at the time. That's no longer the case. And so these graphs that are moving there, each line is showing one country, and it's showing the urban and rural BMI difference. So we all think that cities are bad for obesity. And so what this graph is showing, and it's going through time from 1985 to 2016 or 17, it's showing the urban and rural BMI difference. So if it's a positive number, higher BMI in cities. If it's negative, higher in rural areas. So a couple of things show up here. One is that in the honeycomb wall, there is almost universally higher BMI in rural areas. And anybody who has been to rural areas of America in particular, but actually many other countries, knows that obesity is actually higher there than in cities. But the other thing that it shows is that actually as undernutrition goes down, as time goes by, the gap becomes smaller, and in many middle-income countries, initially for women, subsequently for men, there is actually a reversal. So as countries get to middle income, there is actually, as there is no longer malnutrition, there is an urban advantage in BMI. So even for obesity, that's actually the case, that cities typically do better. One exception is actually Sub-Saharan Africa, and especially women in Sub-Saharan Africa, that the difference goes the other way, but just about everywhere else there's actually a shrinking gap, and in some places reversal of gap of BMI between cities and rural areas. And in fact, so this was work that our group had done, we find that nearly 60% of the global rise in BMI is happening in rural areas, which is higher than the share of the population in rural areas. So the global obesity epidemic, if you wish, is fundamentally a rural phenomenon rather than an urban phenomenon. And this was the sort of coverage that got, that our paradigm has always been that cities, obesity, and actually our paradigm, the empirical data, to the best we can tell, goes the other way. So how do cities create better health? So on the left-hand side here, you can see a table from work that a group in America had done. So they did something very interesting. They actually went to food stores, and they said, let's see what people can buy, and they went to rural areas. So in rural areas, most of the stores are what they call on this graph convenience stores, whereas in cities there are more supermarkets. And they looked at availability of both healthy food items and unhealthy food items. Fresh fruits and vegetables, fresh fish, and low-fat milk, and so on and so on. And they actually see that these are more available and actually typically lower cost in cities, at least in an industrialized country. Even in low-income countries, for things like fresh fruits, well, when they are in season, they are very accessible in rural areas. But when they are not in season, they're actually more accessible in cities, to where there is trade, where there is concentration of population. On the right-hand side was a study that Gunther Fink, who is now in Basel, and his colleagues had done, and they looked at the distance to a health facility, which typically was in cities, and its effects on a set of maternity outcomes, among them neonatal mortality. And as you can see, is that adjusting for a whole bunch of other things, not surprisingly, as a child is born, or as a family lives farther and farther away from a health facility, typically in cities, there is increasing odds of a child dying of neonatal causes. So access to services, access to food. And this paper was published, I think, a couple of years ago. A group looked at distance in time from cities. They mapped it for the entire world, and they looked at Europe, where actually distances are typically very short from cities for everybody to other parts of the world, and the biggest disadvantages are beyond places like Siberia that are very far in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So in fact, the benefits of cities are spreading to the surrounding areas where either distances are shorter or the transport infrastructure is such that people can actually benefit from the services that are in cities. So the CDFs on the right-hand side are showing the cumulative share of the population at various distances, and the one that does the worst noticeably in sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America, and South America, and Europe do quite well. How else? So again, motorization has come up a lot. This was by a group in transport engineering, a study that they looked at Germany, and what they found was that while cities in Germany started becoming motorized first, by around 1960, motorization was everywhere. And actually, as Beata mentioned in her opening statement, she could cycle in Hamburg, and you can cycle in Utrecht, but it's actually quite hard to do that in rural areas and to actually access services that you have. So cities provide actually opportunities for being able to access your services using a range of modes of transportation, where in rural areas it's typically using motorized transport. And of course, I couldn't give my talk without paying tribute to our hosts either. That so this is the situation that we get, and this has been mentioned a few times. So, but cities are unequal, and again on the left-hand side of this, you can see the graph from the work that Christa had done, which looked at the rich to poor, so the poor to rich mortality ratio, and compared rural and rural. So before he was comparing poor between cities and rural areas. Now he's comparing within cities, within rural areas, the rich and the poor. So typically everywhere the poor have higher mortality. But if a point is above the 45-degree line, it means that there is larger inequality, at least larger relative inequality in the city compared to the rural area. So cities are on the y-axis. And again, most of the points are above the 45-degree line. So even though the urban poor are better off than the rural poor, within cities there is larger inequality than there is within rural areas. And the inequalities are typically in short distances, obviously. On the right-hand side, you can see the city where I live, London, and you can see variations in life expectancy. The variations in life expectancy just within London, which are a few years, are as much as a European country and a lower middle income country. So we see that in London, and in fact, work that we are doing, and in parallel with Mike Brower's group in Vancouver, we hypothesize that once we get to smaller and smaller areas, we both see more heterogeneity, but also see the heterogeneity in smaller distances in mortality. And that also exists in our environment. These are two images taken from areas in Accra. You don't need to have been to Accra to actually guess which one is the better place to live, which one is the worse off place in terms of its environment. I suspect if I were to ask everybody in the room would actually get this right. And the same thing in terms of our living environment. These are two cities two areas of London. And again, I don't think that we need to have been to these specific points in London to say that where is the sort of swanky, wealthy area and which one is the lower income council housing. So that inequality in health also reflects itself in inequality in our environment, in our sanitation, in our homes. Now, I would say that this is actually the time we should be focusing more than anything else on inequalities. And I say this more so as a citizen rather than as a scientist. So we are living in a world that inequality is actually tearing apart the fabrics of our society, and it's doing it in the high-income world. I would argue that we are living in a world that election after election, referendum after referendum, the vote of the poor from anger is actually putting forces into power that are affecting all of the things we care about, all of the things that Beata cared about, and the poor are voting out of anger for the sort of things that we don't want to be doing. So again, we can see some of the headlines that in London at least we see by somewhat more progressive newspapers of the sort of things that are happening. The poor dying 10 years younger, and the life expectancy for the poorest of the poor actually declining in a high-income country. So I would say the time is right. But I think there are also two other reasons we should be focusing on inequality in cities. One is that cities are policy innovators. Cities are increasingly bypassing their national governments in terms of the policies they are putting into place. Anything from secondhand smoke to climate change. It's cities that are taking the lead. It also allows people to mobilize. So cities are actually a great place to think about inequalities. And I would argue that the third reason is actually a scientific reason, which is that we now can use data in ways that we couldn't do in the past. So it allows us to actually think about inequalities, about variations, heterogeneities in cities in ways that we traditionally have not. And that's really where a lot of our work is now going, to focus on inequality rather than aggregate health as the outcome of interest in cities. To bring what I think, or at least what I sort of see as perhaps the last phase of my career's research as where we are going, is to understand inequalities in cities and try to understand how to change them. So I will set 3 questions, and they are in some sense my questions, and you may well have, and you will have sort of much better ones. So one is actually how do we take complex urban environments and measure them and characterize them, and really to think about how real people experience the city, rather than the sort of things that we can just put in our statistical models and analyze them. People experience housing, people experience their environment, people experience the transport, and access to services was mentioned a few times in the opening speech by the deputy mayor. People want to have access to services, people want sanitation, safety, people want to live in a place that's safe, food, and all of those issues. How do we measure it? How do we characterize the entire complexity? So again, I will provide one direction, what we are using, and this is, I think, an area that actually environmental epidemiology and exposure science have arguably been ahead of other fields. It's not the only area, but it's one, and we are actually focusing on the role of images. So again, you look at this image of Accra, we as people can say where the better and worse environment arguably is from certain perspectives. So can we do this in a systematic, analytical way? So the task is to track variations in health and its causes. Our data is what I guess I've learned from our computer science colleagues and postdocs and PhD students on structured data in the form of imagery, and the tools are you can't be at a conference these days and not talk about AI. So here is my statement: deep learning tools as a way to actually use it to study health inequalities. Now, we are not the first people to do this. Charles Booth did this in London, in his map of poverty in London. Booth literally used his visuals of the entire London to actually map poverty. It just happens to be the case that it took 27 years to do this, and we'd like to do this somewhat faster. Work that we have started to do is to actually use imagery. So Ezra Sewell, who's a fellow and actually really led this work, she as a proof of concept, she took a whole number of social, environmental, and health outcomes in London on which we had really good data. So we wanted to know the truth: income, quality of the living environment, crime, and what this is showing is taking 3 images from London, one very poor area, one very wealthy area, one middle income area, and we can see right away, and the more blue the colors are, the better off the place is, and the more red they are, the worse off it is. We can see that the rich area on the lower left typically does better, but not in everything. It actually is central London, so it has a lot of air pollution, even though it's doing well in a lot of other things, and there are other places that do well in some measures and not on others. And what she did was that she said, well, I'm going to throw away some of the data. I'm going to pretend it doesn't exist. I'm going to use deep learning to train a neural network, I'm going to train a deep neural network, and I'm going to see how well I can predict the data that I can observe. And one of them is something that in our census and in our statistical service, it's called quality of the living environment. It's a measure of a number of things that go together. And what this graph is showing is the comparison between prediction of deciles and the actual truth. And so if you have a lot of circles just going around, big circles around the 45-degree line, that's really good prediction. And if it's spread out, that's not good prediction, that's as good as random. And actually for quality of living environment, we do really well. Not surprising, because it actually has a lot of visual signals. But we also do well for things like income and for health. And this was using no other information. This was just running it through the network. And actually, the model predicts a fair amount of the variation in this just from images, as people arguably would. But it does badly for other things. It actually does badly for self-reported health. It does well for objective health, but it does badly for self-reported health, and it does badly for crime. And so Ezra started looking at the sociology literature of crime. And actually, it turned out to be the case that sociologists have been asking a similar question, that back in the days, we used to think that, they call it the so-called broken window theory. Where there are a lot of broken windows, there must be crime. And it turns out that that's not the case. Crime is actually distributed in different ways. So images seem to have less information for crime than they have for income. So the question again we are asking is, can we take neighborhoods and entire neighborhoods and actually try to understand the complexity? Features like green space that are perhaps obvious, but in many places open gutters, being playable, having various measures of housing quality, road quality, and so on, using images. So again, this is a satellite image. That's other form of image that is available to us. And again, I'm just going to do this visually. So I've put here 2 images from London, one from Chelsea, a very well-off area, and one from parts of Hackney, that are actually lower income areas of London. And again, you can see the green area of Chelsea on the right-hand side, and Hackney, which is sort of poorer housing and smaller homes and less areas to be there. And I'm showing it to you here for Accra. And again, on the right-hand side, the well-off parts of East Legon, and on the left-hand side, some of the poorer areas, you can visually see this in the satellite images. These are relatively high resolution. Actually, the most high resolution ones give you even more information than this. Now, focus on the left-hand area and look at the roads. There are roads that are dark, the one that's going diagonally, and there are roads that are kind of reddish in color. And that's telling us something about actually whether the road is paved or unpaved. And we can see one of the unpaved roads right there from actually street image. If you look more carefully, and I don't know if it's visible there, alongside some of the roads in Accra, you can see a really thin black line in those satellite images. And what those are actually open gutters. And for many children in poor areas of Accra, that's where they're actually playing. So we can take, again, the environment that people experience and many of its features, not all of it actually understandable from images. So let me go back to the main flow of the talk and actually finish on this. So that's a tool, that's an area we are using. We are trying to actually not let the methodology get ahead of the substance. So we are trying to figure out what are the questions we should be asking before we go and take images and start doing neural networks on them. But I want to put forward 2 other directions we should be thinking about. One is complex health outcomes. And again, we are living in a world that increasingly is thinking beyond things that are specific events at one point in time, that being the most obvious one. And we are thinking about people's morbidity, functional health, and developmental outcomes for children during the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. There is a lot of emphasis, as especially child mortality comes down around the world, to focus on not just keeping people alive, and not just keeping them healthy, but actually making them viable people. And again, this is a tradition that we owe some of it to work that people like Jim Heckman and Bob Fogel in economics have done to actually try to bring health and development together. So how do we measure these, and how do we characterize them, their complexities in our populations? And the third one, which I would argue is probably the biggest challenge to environmental epidemiology, is how do we go beyond establishing causation, and how do we measure impacts of a specific policy. So as a colleague of mine, who is actually an epidemiologist, says as epidemiologists, we are very good at understanding the etiology of causation. We are not as good as understanding the etiology of change. And how do we actually, as policies are being implemented, as societies change, understand what the drivers of change are? So that would be the third direction, and let me end on this. So again, I started from a historical paper, and let me go to a historical paper. If you look at the citation, that paper was published in 1917. So Charles Chapman, our American colleagues would know that he was initially, at that time, he was a superintendent for health in the city of Providence. He actually became one of the founders of modern public health in America. He became the president of American Public Health Association later. And he wrote about his city, Providence. At that time, the city of Providence was spending all of its health budget on rat catchers. And Chapman wanted to see, well, how else can we spend our money? What else can we do with it? So he went through a systematic thought process of what is it that his city needs to be healthier. And he asked questions. He was asking, our city is doing enough, and I'm glad that Utrecht is doing a lot on making its population healthy. He was asking, our city is doing all that they can. And then he started actually coming up with ways. And look at his list on the right-hand side. It has anything from education. It has the traditional things, sanitation, and making sure that the milk that people are drinking is not going bad, and making sure that the drugs that people are, medicines that they are being given are not actually tainted. But he also had things like education, he had care for the poor as his list of things. And again, I would say that our challenge, if we believe that our society needs to put emphasis on equity and on reducing inequalities, is what are the things that matter? How do we measure them? How do we think systematically based on all we know about causality of the policies that could influence them? But then how do we go and evaluate those policies and try to improve them as they're going? So on that, thank you again for the invitation, and I look forward to the discussions and to the rest of the conference.
Many thanks, Majid. Wonderful presentation. We're going to move on to the next speaker. And the next speaker is